Welcome to the Ostrom Avenue podcast. What a rough week it was for Syracuse men's basketball, and we're excited to talk about it alongside Ethan Frank and Johnny Gadamowitz. I'm Ben Shulman. Make sure to check us out on Twitter at Ostrom Avenue Pod or at Ostrom Ave Pod. And if you're listening to us, we post our interviews on YouTube, Ostrom Avenue Podcast there. You can watch all the fun guests that we talk to. Or if you're watching us online, you can usually find full episodes of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, waer.org, wherever you're trying to listen to podcast content. This week, we're going to do something a little bit different. Traditionally, we bring on a guest, recap the last game, talk about the next one. But we already talked about Georgetown, at least the guest that came on. And to be honest, we didn't think you guys would be all that excited about Lehigh and Cornell, both games that we all know Syracuse should win, and they have the edge in. Will they win it? That's a discussion for later, but we'll talk about that in our next episode. Today, we're going to zoom out a little bit because we're getting to the end of the non-conference schedule. The big tests in the non ended with that Georgetown loss. So we just want to zoom out on this team heading into the ACC schedule, which starts on the 29th versus Georgia Tech. Yes, they did play Florida State, but the real conference schedule starts on the 29th. And guys, I think the big overwhelming issue that especially if you listen to the double overtime with WAER Sports Talk and callers are talking about, bench depth, just how shallow this team is right now. This team is usually shallow, though. Johnny, I'll start with you. How different do you think it is this year as opposed to other years where they still run, 7-8 man rotations?
It's the same old story. And, Jim Boeheim has been open about that. He was even asked about it in a post game. I forget exactly which game, but his answer was something to the effect of exactly that. Oh, every year you get asked about the lack of depth. When you're winning, it's not a problem. I think it was post Villanova. And in that Nova game, Nova didn't run a whole lot of guys on the floor. They didn't go too deep into the bench. And Boeheim brought up the example. Look, they're winning. They're doing the same thing. You're not asking them those questions. So, yeah, it's a concern. I mean, you obviously like what you saw from Frank Anselem, particularly in that first half in the Georgetown game. But look, I don't think it's something that needs to be addressed all too much and changed all too much. It's just sort of the way Syracuse basketball operates. They're not going to go to entirely new second unit, but it's presented issues, obviously, when guys get into foul trouble. I think the issue that is more worthy of harping on is not the lack of options that you can go to. It's making sure you're getting production from the guys who are going to be out there consistently, and whether that's from a scoring standpoint or whether it's just staying out of foul trouble so that they can continue to stay on the floor. Look, on the bench from a talent perspective, nobody really is even close to ready to playing serious minutes. In the non-con, it's one thing. ACC play, not even close to ready to playing serious minutes. So I don't think it's something that we should expect to change. I'm not willing to pinpoint it as a reason that it's been a little bit of a rockier start than maybe so many Orange fans hoped. I think you kind of just have to take it at face value for what it is and move on. And look, yes, there are some people who philosophically are just not going to agree with it, especially when you start to have the whole burnout conversation when you're playing in February and March and all the minutes that the Buddy Boeheims and Joe Girards of the world are going to have logged. But I think if you're a Syracuse fan, you look at it, you accept it, and you move on.
So I agree that in a way it's similar. I think it's missing one piece, and that's a guy that they can rely on to play more than 10 minutes. They traditionally don't run deep rotations. You look to last year, you could argue they ran less guys. They only really had 7 instead of 8. Jesse Edwards did play a little bit, but not really, and that was because of injuries. But they had Kadari Richmond going 21 minutes off the bench. Their leader in minutes per game off the bench right now, this might be shocking, is Benny Williams, who's averaging 13 minutes off the bench. And that's not really the position that I think they're concerned about. I think they're concerned about guard, where Kadari Richmond is filling in. Symir Torrance is only playing 11 minutes, and there's no fourth guard. There's no other option. Ethan, what do you think about kind of the guard situation right now? I mean, it feels almost like, in a way, Joe and Buddy are being hung out to dry.
I just don't think they have any other options. I agree. Symir Torrance, I think in that Georgetown game was the first time I've really seen him finish a layup at the basket. He has great speed and great quickness to be able to get to the rim, Ben, but he has not been able to either finish through contact or finish off the backboard with whatever kind of layup he's going for. And he can't really shoot either. We see him working with assistant coach Jerry McNamara a lot on his shooting, but his shooting is not a strength of his. His strength is his defense, his quickness, and his speed to the basket, not his finishing ability. So I think if he were able to build off what he started against Georgetown, then I think that could be huge for Syracuse off the bench. And also, he's still learning the zone. He may be, taller and longer and more athletic than Joe Girard. But this is Joe Girard's third season playing the 2-3 zone. It's Symir Torrance's first months playing the 2-3 zone. So I think he's still learning, but I also think Jim Boeheim needs to give him more of a chance, because we saw Girard have a great first half against Georgetown, and he straight up did not have it in the second half. I think Symir Torrance needed to get a little bit of more run against the Hoyas to show he could build off that strong drive to the rim in the first half and do a good job finding his teammates as well. And I think Buddy needed a little bit of a rest in that second half. He played all 50 minutes against Indiana 2 weeks ago, then had to go down to Florida to play Florida State, back to New York City to play at the Garden, then down to Washington to play Georgetown, with a couple of stops in Syracuse in between. It was a really taxing, 8 to 10 days for this team. And Buddy Boeheim's legs have showed the last few days that his stamina is still working up to be, ACC play ready. So I think Symir Torrance needed to get, 3 to 5 minutes relieving both Buddy and Joe in that second half, and maybe there's a different outcome. Let him show what he can do.
Johnny, you said they're not ready. How do you feel about Ethan's proposal of giving the bench a little bit more run?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good example, Ethan, with Torrance. I would argue, though, I don't necessarily think you give Torrance more minutes for Torrance's sake. And yes, of course, he'll improve with more minutes. But I think it's more for the point you were making before about giving Joe and giving Buddy, those brief appearances on the bench in order to get them ready for meaningful minutes down the stretch. When push comes to shove, do I expect a Symir Torrance to be a focal point offensively or defensively, for that matter, in February and March? No, I don't. But what I do expect him to be able to do is to come in and eat up solid clock so that you have Buddy and Joe not gassed, because we've talked about it before. Ben, I know this is a point you've made. The lack of having a fourth guard on this team is really showing. And obviously with Richmond last year, he was a guy who could be playing starter type minutes, and he played almost starter type minutes off the bench. So it's not even so much that Torrance needs to get going. It's more to give Buddy and Joe some ample rest. But you look at that guard spot, there's nowhere else to turn to. So if the answer is getting Torrance more serious minutes, and sure, maybe a byproduct of that is he'll improve and he'll get better. And who knows, maybe he is a pleasant surprise. I mean, I don't think anyone on this Syracuse bench, I mentioned the Anselm game against Georgetown. It wasn't tremendous. He poured in 5 points and had a pretty strong first half, but didn't get a lot of run in the second. But if Torrance can get going, I think whatever you get from him off the bench, you take it and you run with it, in addition to everything it would mean rest-wise for the starters. But not having that fourth guard is huge, because now you're asking more out of a guy like Torrance, who, to be quite frank, is just not capable of having a whole lot asked of him right now.
I want to disagree with you about this whole 3 guards thing, because if you look at Jim Boeheim's successful teams from the last 5 or so years, they've had 3 guards maximum. Last year, Kadar was the 3rd guard. There was no one else. There was not a 4th guard behind him. And look, it was fine because Kadari was playing 20 plus minutes a game, which is why I think Symir Torrance needs to get up to that 15 to 18 minute range. One, as you said, to give the other guys a rest, but also to get him in a groove. If you look back to 2018 as well, which was before last year, the most recent time Syracuse made the Sweet 16, They had two guards. It was just Tyus Battle and Frank Howard. The only person who even got any minutes that season was Howard Washington before he went down with an injury in the non-conference. And in the NCAA tournament against Michigan State, Frank Howard fouls out. They bring on a walk-on to play as the backup guard. So really it's Boeheim. He's really only been going with maximum 3 guards, and it's worked out. So I understand why a fourth guard would be helpful for this specific team. But if you look at Jim Boeheim's track record, a fourth guard is not going, to be the be all end all and help in big ways. I think it's more about getting Symir Torrance more minutes and getting him in a rhythm. And if you have that 3-guard rotation where everyone's helping out, everyone's filling their role, I think it could be really effective.
But I think because Torrance is so far away from that point where you can rely on him, maybe not Kadari, but something close to Kadari, you need someone else in that group. And I think that's where not having that fourth guy to maybe parlay Torrance with someone, having 2 guys that aren't going to give you the Kadari type numbers or the Kadari type minutes, but can sort of complement each other, provide that rest. I think that's something that would do dividends for this team.
I will say too, well, I agree with Ethan on the Michigan State year. Last year, to be fair, there was a time when Buddy was out. There was a time when Joe was out, and they could slide Allen to the 2. And was he good at the top of the zone? No. But they had the ability to put someone on it and trust them to play 20-plus minutes. So I'm kind of in the middle of you guys. If they had a Kadari or had someone who could eat up 20-ish minutes and feel good about it, then I don't think they need a fourth guard. But they also don't have that right now. And you can, there's a world where you play Symir more and he gets better and it's worth it. And there's also a world where you play Symir more and he doesn't get to the point that you want him to, and it hurts the team and they lose games. And as we saw from, the back-to-back losses this past week, now the second season ever in Jim Boeheim's tenure with 5 non-con losses, they need to start winning games right now. I'm going to put a cap on the bench depth discussion for now. I'm sorry, Ethan, I know you want to say more, but we will have plenty of time to continue to argue it during this season. And I want to transition over to the other, perennial problem, frankly. We've talked about it a lot. It's rebounding. This team continues to get beat at it. Is there a fix? What would that fix be? Ethan, I'll start with you because you were chomping at the bit there. What's the solution here to the fact that this team is consistently outmuscled on the boards?
It's the problem with the zone. The weakness of the zone is rebounding because you're not able, and boxing out is almost a thing of the past in all levels of basketball at this point, but you're not able to box out because you don't have a specific guy. You run to the closest guy, but that could lead to all kinds of confusion and leaving a guy open. But in the zone, the main people that should be grabbing the rebounds are the forwards, are the wings in Swider and Boeheim and Benny, if Boeheim ever puts him in the game. So it should be Jimmy and Cole who are the ones, which is why Cole is the leading rebounder on this team, because in theory, Jesse Edwards is going to be at the high post guarding the guy in the middle of the zone. So you're going to need those guys on the wing to crash the boards. But against the zone, you always have long shots, which lead to long rebounds. So there's also a responsibility on Buddy and Joe, who are closing out on these shooters, to box the guys out on the 3-point line, because more often than not, the rebounds are coming out towards the foul line, towards the 3-point arc. So it's really a team effort. It's not schematic at all. It's all about effort, and it's all about positioning yourself to be able to get the rebound based on where you are in the zone. It's not, if you throw in this person, they're going to get more rebounds. It's all about where they are positioned on defense.
Yeah, Ethan, I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I think that all makes sense, and I'm willing to pinpoint a lot of it to effort too. I will say though, as glaring as a problem as this has appeared to be, and the narrative that it's really taken on, like this team has found ways to sort of overcome that. And I know the record doesn't show that, but you look at that Indiana game, they get out rebounded on the boards by 15. Like that's no small margin, and still find a way to win the game. So they've proven that it's doable and they're capable of winning games even when they're not getting after it on the glass. but this is a team that just does not really have a whole lot of size. Once you're going up against ACC opponents, that's going to increase tenfold. So while there are some issues, and while you would like to see the numbers tip a little more in Syracuse's favor, and there's not many reasons to believe that's going to happen anytime soon, I'm hesitant to say that that is a huge piece as to why some of these losses haven't been wins. Ben, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that matter.
I would agree with you that I think they can overcome it, but I think the ceiling is lower for them because of it. And, this team, as Ethan said with the zone, they're never going to be a good rebounding team. To expect them to even have a positive rebounding margin in the ACC is foolish. But they played Villanova, who does get after it, but doesn't have anyone taller than 6'8". And they got out-rebounded in their own half. Villanova had 27 offensive boards. Syracuse had 25 defensive boards. That is outrageous. You can't, that's near worst in the country in getting rebounds. You can't completely lose the lid on your own half. And I think the one thing that worries me maybe the new variation to the zone, which I know they keep saying is not a 1-3-1, but it has a bill and webbed feet. So it's a duck. It looks like a 1-3-1. They switch out of it mid-play, which makes it a 2-3 modification. They'll go back and forth. But Jesse at center has to run sideline to sideline, and the wings are pushed up a little bit more. And we saw this last year, even when the wings were just pushed up a little bit more in the 2-3, it hurts them rebounding. And last game versus Georgetown, the 1-3-1 or the 1-1-3 or whatever you want to call it, got beat right where it's supposed to not get beat. It's supposed to stop people from getting to the free throw line, unlike the 2-3, which is weak at the free throw line. And Aminu Muhammad looked like Kobe Bryant. I mean, he was just rising above everyone and hitting shots from everywhere. So, I'll go back to you, Johnny. Is the trade-off for you worth it? It was the same in the Indiana game where half the game they went to that 1-3-1. Is the trade-off worth it to play slightly better defense but be a slightly worse rebounding team?
I think so, because of the reason you mentioned, Ben. This team is never really going to be a good rebounding team. So if you're already not really getting it done on the boards, I'd take the option that gives you a little bit better defense and maybe a little worse on the boards, because you're already pretty bad on the boards anyway. So I think defensively, look, this team is still trying to figure it out. Obviously, the defense has been an area that has received a lot of criticism. I'm not necessarily opposed to making changes and adjusting on the fly at the mercy of not being in as great of a position to crash on the boards, just because, like you mentioned, Ben, that's just sort of the identity of who this team is. And I think Orange fans need to kind of just accept that at this point.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Johnny. And I think we've kind of hammered home the rebounding point. It's not going to change. It's not going to get any better. And I think this is really, from a big picture perspective, it really is why the zone is not as good as it has been in the past. I mentioned 2018 earlier. Syracuse was 5th on KenPom in defense in 2018 when they went to the Sweet 16. Their offense wasn't very good, but their defense was really, really good. And I think it's a personnel thing, one. And I think it's a way that college basketball as a whole has changed, because when Boeheim really started using the zone in the 90s and the early 2000s, the emphasis in the game was not about shooting. And now today, where, you have Steph Curry, we just saw him break the 3-point record. His influence on not only professional basketball, but college basketball, which some people say is also professional basketball, I think is profound, because most teams, you look at what Nate Oates has done at Alabama, and you look what Colgate did against Syracuse, teams, no matter if they're making it or not, are just going to keep shooting threes, because 3 is worth more than 2. And the zone is designed to make you shoot from the perimeter. It is not designed to give up points inside. So now, as teams are shooting more threes, it is not going to help the zone at all. And especially with the personnel of this Syracuse team, where it's not, a Syracuse team of the early 2010s, late 2000s, where it's a bunch of athletes, both at the top and the bottom of the zone. You look at Joe Girard, Buddy Boeheim, Jimmy Boeheim, Cole Swider, 4 out of 5 starters. These guys are not, the tallest, most athletic, the lengthiest guys in the world. compared to what we've seen out of Syracuse teams in the past. So I think it's a big picture problem in that college basketball is more designed to shoot from the perimeter, and Syracuse's personnel is not designed to play the 2-3 zone.
Yeah, you could get me going for 2 hours on how this team has completely abandoned the way they used to recruit for 40 years of success. Lord knows that Matt Bonaparte and Brad Klein, who came to Washington with me, heard it enough this week. And I've told just about anyone who wants to listen. But I think we've all come to an agreement that although the rebounding might be an issue, the way to solve it would be to scrap the program. And you're not going to scrap the program. The 2-3 is going to stay. So I think we've reached kind of a mutual conclusion there. Let's focus a little bit less on, certain aspects of the team and more on the schedule. We talked about it this year. This is the toughest non-con since I've been here. Some have argued it's the toughest non-con in a decade, in a while. It included the battle for Atlantis, which saw, in a matchup with number 19 Auburn. Yes, they lost to you. That wasn't really a tough game. They played Villanova. Indiana was undefeated when they played Indiana. They had Florida State in the early ACC game, which just continues to be a really weird thing that they keep doing. Of course, they just lost to Georgetown on the road, which I think I a little bit scoffed at when people included that in a tough part of the non-con. I was wrong. It was different. It was different than the hometown tour that Jim usually does, where he invites all teams from the tri-state area that want to travel. Johnny, did having these tough games backfire on the Orange? Is it a bad thing in hindsight that they played this rough schedule?
I don't think it necessarily backfired, Ben, but I will say this. You better go win these Lehigh and Cornell games. Like, if there is any remote slip up, you imagine throwing a Lehigh or Cornell loss on top of a Colgate loss. Like, we knew it was going to be a tough non-con, but because of how tough it was, you need to go take care of business in the games that you're supposed to take care of. And I would maybe throw Georgetown in that conversation too. Like, we talked about it on the podcast last week, how this is a Georgetown team that is not the typical Hoya team that we're used to. So there's already, if you want to include Georgetown in that bunch, two pretty bad non-con losses that don't fall under that umbrella of, okay, well, this was a really tough slate, really tough game, early season, still figuring out who you are. Like, A, no, that's not the case. And B, we're in the middle of December now. Like, it's one thing to make that case against Colgate when it's November 20th and you're still getting going and it's only game 3 on the year. Now, not the case anymore. After you've played Indiana, Florida State, Villanova, these games should not just be wins, but they should handily be wins. But to answer your question, no, I don't think it's a backfire. I'd rather go through these tough games and these tough losses now, learn how to persevere through them, learn how to bounce back. For the record, maybe it doesn't look great. For the resume, maybe it doesn't look great. But hopefully, I'm not going to be able to answer that question until we see how they fare against, I don't want to say the Dukes and Carolinas, but the other cream of the crop ACC schools come February. I think that will really show us whether or not going all out with the scheduling here in November and December was worth it. As it stands right now, I'd say no, but I'd put a little asterisk on that and say it's TBD.
Ethan, what do you think?
I'm going to disagree with Johnny once again, not just for the sake of disagreement, but because
you're coming at me today.
but because I truly think that it was a mistake. Jim Boeheim, he's a very smart guy. He's been coaching for 46, 47 years now. He knows what he's doing, but this is a team with 3 new starters and basically 6 new players. Really, Buddy and Joe are really the only guys who got significant minutes last year that are still on this team out of the 8 guys who are getting time. So when you look at the schedule, I understand, the pub of going to Atlantis, going to the Bahamas, playing Villanova at the Garden, playing Georgetown, you have to play the Big Ten ACC Challenge and, the conference schedule, but they played 6 straight power conference opponents in a row in late November and early December. And for a team that, thankfully they got to have a normal off season where they had, their summer practices, their fall practices. I just think they needed more time to gel together on the court in game action. What they had the 2 exhibitions, and then they had Lafayette and Drexel before they let up 100 points to Colgate at the Dome before going to Atlantis. So I just think, I understand wanting to play these power conference opponents, but this team did not need to be tested so early. And obviously this is an argument that I probably would not have made before them because I was very optimistic coming into the season, but hindsight is 2020, and the 2020 is seeing that these Lehigh and Cornell games probably should have been scheduled before they went to Atlantis. You can't, obviously the Atlantis is always going to take place in that week of Thanksgiving, but if you could have had more games, more tune-ups before you went and played higher competition, I think it would have been really beneficial for this team to be able to mesh better and build better chemistry on the court and get guys minutes playing the zone that didn't play it last year. You look at Torrance, Williams, Anselm, Edwards got a little run there at the end. Swider and Jimmy Boeheim all did not play the zone last year. And Boeheim said, Coach Boeheim says he can teach the zone in 2 to 3 weeks. But when guys are constantly, not closing out on shooters and missing spots on the 3-point line and also in the paint trying to help out Jesse, I think this team really could have used more game action to gel together before facing, tougher competition.
You mentioned moving Lehigh or Cornell before. Is Colgate not a tune-up game? I mean, I know they lost, but they literally had not lost since Kennedy was in office. So
it is a tune-up game, but Colgate is not at the level that like Lafayette, Drexel, or Lehigh is at. Colgate is a really good mid-major school. Matt Langell has done a great job. They made a couple NCAA tournaments in a row. They're the class of the Patriot League, if I may say.
I think all the Bucknell fans who listen to the pod would be angry at that. But I think where I go with it kind of draws from both of you guys. I don't think it backfired. I think what backfired is that they played brutally at times. Like I just think, the tough games are what they are. But let's say they beat Colgate, which they had done 60 something years in a row, and they beat VCU, who has shown to be not a team that they should lose to. Frankly, they only played well in the battle. They've come back and not played very well. It's a totally different look. If they're 7-3 right now instead of 5-5, and their only losses are to, everything changes if they beat VCU, but let's just do a weird future where their only losses are to Auburn, Villanova, and then you lose the rivalry game to Georgetown. I think we're talking about this team very differently right now. So as much as the difficult games made this obviously a more taxing stretch, and perhaps you can attribute them losing to Georgetown to some of the trips that they made, which, I agree, it's probably a tiring stretch. If they just beat who they were supposed to beat and lost to everyone else, it would have been fine. But they did the Syracuse thing, lost to a couple teams they shouldn't have, beat Florida State, which, kudos to them. But I just think, them not playing well is worse than this schedule. They could have succeeded within this schedule at 7-3 at this point, but you lose to Colgate and you lose to VCU, and all of a sudden, this is too many difficult games in too many days. To me, the math doesn't totally add up. I don't know how either of you guys feel about that.
I really think it's a fatigue thing. As I mentioned before with the travel, like you mentioned, Boeheim in his press conferences a lot has been talking. I think the number was they've only practiced 5 times in 15 days in this last 2-week stretch. So he's really hurt that this team needs more practice time, because since they went to the Bahamas, they have barely even practiced at all, and that was almost a month ago at this point. So I just think they need more time to get together, and this week off from Georgetown to Lehigh is going to be great for that. Then they have another week off between Cornell and Georgia Tech. I think that these this 2-3 week stretch where you're finishing up the non-conference and then ACC play starts will be really beneficial for this team. But I believe what Coach Boeheim is saying, in that this team needs a little time to relax, recharge its batteries, because we've seen them play well in first halves. It's been the second half that has been the real problem. And I think that's a fatigue and a stamina thing. They played too many games in too many days. They traveled too much. And I think they just needed some time to, sleep in their own beds practice and play in the Dome.
Ethan, I just want to clarify something with you. So where you're saying you were opposed to the non-conference slate itself in terms of the actual opponents, or was your issue more so the order of you would have had Lehigh, Cornell bumped up a bit?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's more the order. I think the ACC kind of dealt Syracuse a bad hand, throwing Florida State in there between Indiana and Villanova. Like if you have Florida State, before, let's say you switch Cornell and Florida State.
Oh, that's
where Syracuse gets to stay at home for that whole week. And
you can't switch Florida State, though. That's the ACC. That's not you.
Right. I'm saying the ACC dealt Syracuse a bad hand by throwing that game where they did at the beginning of December. I think Syracuse would be a much stronger basketball team if they had come home from the Bahamas, played Indiana at home, played a lesser non-conference opponent at home before going against Villanova and Georgetown. I think that would have made for a much easier, one, travel schedule, and two, performance on the court for the Orange.
All right. Well, for our audio only listeners, my internet is crumbling. Thank you, Spectrum. Not a sponsor of the pod. Will never be. Let's move on to looking ahead. We've talked about the non-con. This team was super hyped up. I think we went on and Johnny and I both kind of didn't agree necessarily that this team was going to be that fantastic, but a lot of people thought good. And they've been a bit of a disappointment so far. How are you feeling about this team now versus before the year?
I think it's still pretty status quo. For me, I think I give the same answer last week, Ben. It really hasn't changed a whole lot. The Georgetown loss is frustrating, but they've shown us signs. I mean, you take down Florida State, that's a big win. And as ugly as a loss as, say, the Colgate game was, or anything else that has been tough over these past few weeks, you knew what you were going to get with Nova. But as tough as the Georgetown loss was, I'm still kind of in wait and see mode. I know some people are abandoning ship and saying this isn't a tournament team and all that. I'm not even close to that point yet. If you come out and dominate Lehigh and dominate Cornell in the way that you're supposed to, then you're looking at 7-5 going into ACC play. You get momentum back on your side. Your first two conference games are home right around that New Year's mark, with Georgia Tech on the 29th and then a big game against UVA on New Year's Day. So maybe it's just the nature of college basketball and how many games there are on the schedule and how many opportunities you have to really right the ship. But I don't think this is a team that, look, am I feeling good? No, I'm not close to feeling good, but I don't think it's time to press the panic button just yet. I mean, there's nothing wrong if you told me at the start of the year that this would be Syracuse's record once they get through X amount of games with the opponents they've had, I'd say, oh, okay, sounds about right. And I think that's where I stand right now still.
I would like to see them have, be 6-4 or 7-3. You have 3 bad losses with Colgate, VCU, and Georgetown. So you're probably usually going to lose one of those games. So I think 7-3 probably should have been a little more attainable. But I'm looking at the ACC stretch right now, because at 5-5, this team is nowhere close to a tournament team right now. And the ACC looks to be, down a little bit once again, as they were last year. UVA is not the same team. So the first 6 games, I think, of the heart of this ACC schedule are going to be really telling. You have Georgia Tech and Virginia at home, like you mentioned, Johnny. Then you go to Miami and Wake Forest for a 2-game road trip, then come back to play Pittsburgh, who is god awful. And then you host Florida State, who you already beat on the road. So I think if Syracuse goes 4-2 or better in those games, I think then they're in a decent spot. But they need to go at least 4-2 to have a chance, really. You don't want to say it's do or die at this point so early in the season, but with those 3 bad non-conference losses, they need to win at least 4 of those 6 games.
The interesting thing about this team is, the Florida State matchup you mentioned. They did beat Florida State, which I don't know what the net rankings are today, but that's going to be a quad 1 win on the road against Florida State. And last year, the entire discussion was they've taken care of business, but they haven't really picked up a big win. They don't have that quad one win. NC State kept ducking in and out. And they have their quad one win before we really even started the ACC schedule. So I agree with you guys in a way that, like, it's not time to panic. Is it time to be disappointed a little bit or frustrated? Sure. I mean, there are definitely wins this team has left on the table and some bad trends, like we talked about with the depth and rebounding. But there's so many opportunities for good wins, even in a down ACC. A down ACC, you know, like Aaron Rodgers said a few years ago, my worst years are other guys' best years. There are still top 25 wins, quad one wins to be had all around. So I agree with you, Ethan. I think they need at least 4 wins out of that stretch. It's such a weird conference this year that I think, like, Virginia, they got to have, but like Georgia Tech, Wake, and Florida State are kind of the tougher teams in that bundle. Wake Forest is not a slouch this year. They will be a tough matchup on the road. So I think there's a lot that can still be had. They're just going to, instead of having that Syracuse year like they did last year where they beat everyone they're supposed to, don't beat anyone they're not supposed to, and sneak in, they need to do the more typical Syracuse thing and beat a bunch of teams that they shouldn't, lose to a bunch of teams that they shouldn't, and really throw Joe Lunardi's head for a whirl. But the NCAA tournament is absolutely still up for grabs. It's way too early to rule this team out of postseason play, at least in my opinion. I don't know what you guys think, but I think we've covered it pretty well in terms of all of us believing that the book is far from closed on this season. It is, however, closed on this episode. We went a lot longer than I thought we were going to, but we had a lot of fun, and we hope you did listening. Make sure to check us out on Twitter at Ostrom Avenue Pod. You can find all our individual Twitters there if you want to check up with us as well. You can check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, waer.org. Not sure where you're listening, but you can check us out on any platform you need to. Also watch us on YouTube. As I mentioned, Syracuse men's basketball back in action, and we will have it coming up on Saturday against Lehigh. That game is at 6 o'clock, which was a little later than I thought it would be. But countdown to tip-off follows suit at 5:30. Make sure to tune in then, and make sure to tune in next week to the next Ostrom Avenue podcast. But for Ethan Frank and Johnny Gadamowitz, I'm Ben Shulman. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.